Last video, I talked about the predictable consequences of the fraudulent lockdown bargain that no matter how appropriately cautious it may have sounded at the time, there's just no escaping the reality that reduced production and increased money supply results in inflation. And yet, this president insists that unavoidability is somehow a lie.
I don't want to hear any more of these lies about reckless spending. We're changing people's lives.
And I'm not even blaming him uniquely. It's an approach that started under the prior president with unanimous Republican support in the Senate and only a handful of opposition votes in the House. It's not a partisan point. It's just to say that when we deny the nature of the problem, we perpetuate the problem. There's a very similar political incoherence now happening with oil and gas. When you run an entire campaign and early presidency on not just hostility, but at times a promise to end the industry outright.
No more drilling on federal lands. No more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends.
Would you close down the oil industry?
By the way, I would transition from the oil industry, yes.
Oh,
I will
that's
transition.
a big statement.
It is a big statement.
That's a
because
big statement.
I would stop.
Why would you do that?
Because the oil industry pollutes significantly.
The natural consequence is reluctance to invest in that industry. If you tell me that lemonade stands will be banned tomorrow, or at least so heavily regulated that the prospect for profit is near zero, I'm not going to the hardware store to buy wood. I'm not going to the grocery store to buy lemons. I just won't build a lemonade stand. I'll look for something else to do instead, since you're telling me that you're looking for ways to shut them down, or at least transition to a different refreshing summer beverage. And even if you do hate lemonade stands, that's fine. I guess you're entitled to your opinion, but please at least be consistent about it. If you're telling me that lemonade stands will be banned tomorrow, you don't get to simultaneously tell me to take my money and go build one anyway. Why would I? By your own statements, it'll just be a colossal waste of time and money. Yet that is exactly what the Biden administration is now telling the oil companies. We don't want any more of your industry, but also please get out there and increase the capacity of your industry. This is Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, completely incoherent on CNN this week.
5 years from now, 10 years from now, are you telling me you want them drilling for more oil? You want the refineries putting out more gasoline in 5 or 10 years?
What we're saying is today we need that supply increased. Of course, in 5 or 10 years, actually in the immediate, we are also pressing on the accelerator, if you will, to move toward clean energy. Ultimately, America will be most secure when we can rely upon our own clean domestic production of energy.
So, no. Apparently, they don't want increased oil refining capacity 5 years from now. They want green energy. They just want increased oil refining capacity today, okay, but increasing that capacity requires a future to make the investment. There will be no lemonade tomorrow, only soda. Now get out there and build a lemonade stand. No. Why would I? And maybe you could call that just a one-off confused interview, and it would be nice if it was, but of course, it is not. It is the formal policy of the Biden administration as articulated in a formal letter to the oil company executives this week. Instead of asking what efforts could ease gas prices, they'll just try yelling this same incoherence at them instead. We hate you. We want a future where your business is erased, but also get to work building up that business right now. That is the general summary of this letter that Biden sent to the leadership of all the major oil companies on Tuesday. I don't know what you guys are doing, but you're making way too much money and not producing enough, so stop it, or else I'm going to send my crazy energy secretary lady to come yell at you too. In fairness, there is a little more to the letter than just incoherent yelling. There is an alleged logic to it, but not much. The letter has two specific central allegations. Number one, that the oil companies aren't refining as much gasoline as they could or should. And number two, that the reason they aren't doing more refining is because they enjoy higher prices and profits as a result of the constrained supply. And Biden actually said the same thing at the end of his speech at the Port of Los Angeles last week, with the added accusation that ExxonMobil isn't paying their taxes either.
Why aren't they drilling? Because they make more money not producing more oil. Exxon, start investing. Start paying your taxes. Thanks.
Does he have evidence of ExxonMobil tax evasion? No, of course not. Because the truth is actually the opposite. Exxon paid billions in taxes in the first quarter of this year. Again, he's just yelling at them to spend their money in illogical ways. Pay more in taxes than you're legally required to. No. Why would I? Invest more in oil production. No, you're the guy who says that industry has no future in this country. And just like the speech, the letter lacks any factual basis either. The two central accusations that oil companies are producing in low numbers and that they're doing that for the purpose of growing profits completely fall apart when you take a closer look. Biden's letter accuses the oil companies of making a business decision to reduce production without giving any detailed numerical breakdown to say whether or not that's actually true. Because when you look at the numbers from his own energy department, it isn't. In fact, U.S. refining is nearly at capacity, 94% in the most recent June numbers, meaning U.S. oil refineries are producing 94% of the gasoline that they could possibly produce at full capacity. That's the highest rate since 2019, right before the COVID downturn. With a couple of caveats. It is true that capacity itself has dropped slightly since then, down about 5%. And it's also true that operating at near 100% capacity doesn't mean that you can't grow capacity, in theory. But that requires the sort of investment environment that we started with. You don't build a lemonade stand when the regulators tell you that the future is soda. Likewise, you don't build an oil refinery when the regulators tell you that the future is alternatives either. And so, they haven't. For decades, the last major U.S. refinery built started operating in 1977. And earlier this month, the Chevron CEO says he doesn't expect another one ever to be built in the U.S. again because it requires massive investment. It takes years to build and years more still to make it profitable and get a return to shareholders. And that's if the company even successfully navigates the regulatory minefield at all. It takes years to get through the red tape, and the efforts at building major refineries since 1977 have generally just lost the battle of attrition. The litigation and other legal obstacles are so costly that it just isn't even worth it to try. Meaning, any call for increasing production must be paired with serious efforts at removing the obstacles to that production to have any credibility or practicality. Well, what do you mean they can't profit, you might say, and the president does? They're profiting at record levels right now, and that's the problem. Well, that too is only the quickest possible skimming of the truth, at best. Hat tip Ed Morrissey over at Hot Air, who gathered up all the numbers. Biden says U.S. refiners are diving into Scrooge McDuck profit pools, but not really. Looking at companies operating the top 10 U.S. refineries by capacity, for the largest one, we can't even see the numbers actually because it's owned by a private Saudi company, but for publicly traded companies that we can see, they're posting pretty typical profit margins, often after posting massive losses last year, which is never mentioned by the president. For example, Marathon, the company at the largest refining facility for which we have data, 3.8% profit first quarter this year after a loss in the first quarter last year. ExxonMobil, Biden's favorite target, a 6% profit first quarter this year. That's an improvement on 4.6% first quarter last year. Chevron did a little bit better, 11.5% profit first quarter of this year. That's an improvement on 4.3% first quarter last year. Now, are those numbers some historical abuse of the consumer? No. Those are numbers right in line with normal. Energy industry average profit margin is right about 5 or 6%, actually well below other industries. Tech, consumer discretionary like fancy clothes or entertainment, and specifically financial sectors all had average profit margins well above the supposedly greedy oil companies. So on what basis does Biden say that oil company profits are setting records? Generally, by looking at profits as a dollar figure rather than a percentage. $1 billion sounds like a lot of money. But if it costs you $100 billion to make it, well, then it really isn't. And that's generally the case in the oil industry. Again, Take ExxonMobil, for example. They made $5.5 billion in the first quarter of this year. More money than God, as Joe Biden put it. But it cost them $82 billion to make it. So more money than God times 15 in expenses. And of course, another reason those profit dollars look inflated is because they are. And so are the costs. It costs the oil companies more to operate because those costs are more expensive, just like everything else. If costs are higher, then the price of their product will have to increase to compensate, which means increased revenues and in turn, increased profit. But only as a raw dollar figure, not as a percentage. $100 was a nice profit 100 years ago. $100 profit today isn't. But even more frustrating, let's say that all of Biden's premises are actually true. Let's say that production and refining really are just that easy and can just be done on a moment's snap. And let's say that Exxon and the other big players aren't doing that because they love cashing in on higher prices pushed on the consumer to pad their greedy wallets. That means it would be easy for a competitor to make the product more cheaply, assuming no other obstacles. So just get the hell out of the way, Joe. This doesn't take your yelling. It just takes you shutting up and going away. As your own letter notes, there are market incentives to fix this. But he can't. He just has to shout the incoherence. Lower the prices, but don't drill and don't refine. And don't build any pipeline infrastructure. And don't count on a future for your industry either. And don't do any of the things that actually would lower prices. Just lower them. Don't think about the logic or the risks. Just do it. Because if you don't, the old man won't just yell at you. He'll shake his fist, too. Biden is threatening unspecified executive action if the oil companies don't do as he says. Another non-incentive. Hey, you! Build a successful business so we can take it over. And note the backward tone. You oil executives need to work with me, not, hey, what can I do to help you solve this problem? A question the oil companies answered, despite Biden not even asking it. The American Petroleum Institute released a 10-point plan of deregulation the same day that Biden sent this letter. Actions Washington could take today to move toward lower costs. But of course, Biden won't. He'll just keep yelling, despite overwhelming public opinion yelling back at him to try any of these steps instead, and despite massive electoral consequences incoming for his party when he doesn't, and despite the obvious effect of his actions being the worsening of the problem that he's supposedly trying to fix. You don't reduce energy costs by vilifying and threatening the producers of energy. Just like you don't get neighborhood lemonade stands if you threaten every little girl who builds one. Then again, I suppose it's best for those little girls to stay out of Joe Biden's neighborhood anyway. We've all seen how that situation works out. If there's one face more uncomfortably frustrated than an oil executive's reading that letter, it would be this one. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.